Glad to say that we've got an excellent panel of guests, excellent panel of speakers and moderator to lead us through a discussion of ocean carbon dioxide removal permitting and siting, which is something that bubbled up in our town hall. It's why we're having our event today the way we're having it, because people in our community thought this was an excellent topic to pursue. And certainly with the tremendous potential of ocean carbon dioxide removal, understanding how to get projects going in coastal waters, deep sea waters, it's critical to understand how to get permitting squared away. Few logistics questions before we get going. One, this is being recorded. It's going to be put on our YouTube channel afterwards. First, we're going to do, as we typically do, have our discussion for about 40 or 45 minutes, and then it'll be time for you, our audience, to break in and ask questions of your own. I'll be monitoring the chat, and so any questions that you feel are relevant to the panel, I would like to feel free to ask them, and then I'll call on you if we have time in order to have you ask yourself. At the top of the hour, we'll stop and then have our networking session for half an hour afterwards, as we usually do. That's not going to be recorded. So it'll be 60 minutes of our panel conversation, followed by 30 minutes of networking if you want to hang around for that. Don't feel obligated. Goodness knows we're all busy, but it's a nice way for people to get to know each other, not just know of each other in carbon removal. So without any further ado, I want to say once again, thank you for coming to our event today. And I want to leave you in the hands of Jessica Dabrowski, who will be moderating our conversation. Jessica.
Thank you so much, Jason. So I'm Jessica Dabrowski, and I am a chemical oceanographer who's really nerdy about marine CDR. I'm super excited for our panel today, which consists of Zach, Cameron, and Diane. The goal of today's panel is to have a broad and open discussion on marine CDR permitting and siting, specifically in the context of the United States, especially given the expertise of our panel, to help inform those of you who are here as CDR entrepreneurs or job seekers or those from CDR companies. So that's kind of the lens of our panel. And I'll hand it over first to Zach to give a brief introduction on yourself.
Thanks, Jessica. Thanks for moderating, and thanks to Jason and Airminers for hosting this. So I'm Zach Cockrum. I am the Director of Policy and Partnerships for Vesta. Vesta is a ocean-based carbon dioxide removal company. We place naturally occurring olivine sand and nearshore coastal systems to combine coastal protection with carbon removal. As olivine dissolves over time, it reacts with carbonic acid that's in excess in the ocean and precipitates the excess carbon to the bottom of the ocean. This is a really timely conversation for us because we have just recently completed permitting at the state and federal level for a pilot project in Duck, North Carolina, where we'll be deploying a small amount of 6,000 cubic yards of olivine near the Army Corps of Engineers Field Research Facility to monitor the effectiveness and risks and benefits of this approach in a small-scale field trial.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Zach. Cameron, over to you if you can introduce yourself.
Thank you, Jessica. Cameron Fisher, 48 North Solutions. We're an environmental consulting company based in Seattle, Washington. We provide support to our clients getting everything, all things wet and salty, essentially, deployments in the marine environment. We work from Florida up to Alaska and from probably Hawaii over to Massachusetts. We do focus on the stream, nearshore and offshore environments, and we support a wide range of clientele, predominantly though in the marine renewable energy sector. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Diane, last but not least.
Hi, everyone. Diane Hoskins. I'm the Global Policy Director for the Carbon to Sea Initiative. Our mission is to systematically assess the conditions under which ocean alkalinity enhancement can deliver safe, cost-effective, and permanent carbon dioxide removal. I've spent over a decade working at the intersection of public policy, climate and energy, and ocean conservation for organizations like Oceana, the Nature Conservancy, and the Pew Charitable Trusts. And thanks for the opportunity to be here and talk about this very important topic.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So I've divided today's discussion mostly into 3 topics. And where I want to start is just laying the foundation or a little bit of a foundation and discussion about what we know about MCDR permitting so far, and also what is our lack of knowledge on MCDR permitting. So I want to just start, anyone is Zach, Cameron, or Diane, feel free to jump in. What agencies or regulatory bodies currently have a stake in MCDR, or do we foresee having a stake in MCDR?
Yeah, I can take a crack at that one, but I'd love to hear more from Zach about his recent experience. I think that's real world experience that would I think would be real value. But you have 3 levels of regulatory governance: state, local, state, and federal. At the local, it would be the local municipality. If it's a, I'm going to pick on Zach for a second. If you're working on a city beach, for example, or a county beach, that would be the local. Then you'd have the state. It would be, if you're in Washington State, for example, it's the Washington Department of Ecology, or New Jersey, it could be DEP, depending on who oversees that. Probably depending on the technology, maybe the Clean Water Act or thereabouts. And at the federal level, I would start at least at the Army Corps of Engineers. That would be your front door to the federal agencies. From there, they could potentially pull in the EPA, National Marine Fisheries Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, depending on the type of technology that you would be looking to deploy and harness in the marine environment. But I'll pass it to Zach. Actually, I think your real world experience would be of value.
Yeah, thanks, Cameron. Yeah, there are a lot of agencies that have some stake in marine carbon dioxide removal from whatever their agency mission might be, whether it's supporting research in the case of NOAA, or Department of Energy trying to support early stage investigation and carbon removal. From a permitting perspective, for most approaches, the EPA is really the lead regulator. If the EPA has pretty clearly said that if you're a point source pollution, or you're an existing outflow, and some approaches are that, then you go through Clean Water Act point source regulations. If you are far offshore doing open ocean deployments or biomass sinking, that's pretty clearly the Marine Protections Research and Sanctuaries Act, or also known as marine dumping. For us, in the middle of those environments, we secured our permits under the Clean Water Act, under the dredge and fill provisions, as Cameron was suggesting. That's a typical approach for regulating coastal protection projects and beach restoration activities. And even though our placement was is going to be far offshore, in about 1,500 feet off of the coast and in 25 feet of depth, we're altering the bottom of the ocean, and we are theoretically affecting navigation of the ocean, which is pretty clearly within the wheelhouse of the Army Corps of Engineers. We're operating in an environment where none of the statutes we have really apply specifically to marine carbon dioxide removal. So we have to kind of look at what is it most like. And we have to, stretch some of the capabilities, I think, of agencies to apply those considerations to us. I think at the federal level, like I said, it was Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. At the state level in North Carolina, we went through the Coastal Area Management Act, which is a very similar state level statute that regulates these activities, and these processes moved at the same time. During the course of our permit application, there was a question from the EPA as to whether or not the marine dumping provisions of the Marine Protection Resource and Sanctuaries Act applied to our activities. Ultimately, we did not have to seek an MPRSA permit for this project. I think we can talk about, I think there will be a lot of comments throughout the panel on the challenges of lack of clarity, potential competing jurisdiction, and the issues that causes in terms of driving certainty that's really needed for startups to be doing some of the foundational R&D and MCDR. So I'm sure we'll get into that more later. But in the state and federal processes, Cameron is also right that throughout the permitting application process, there's interagency consultation. So you have Fish and Wildlife Service at the table, you have NOAA's protected species or protected habitats, and all of these agencies are consulted during the permitting process and get to have a chance to ask specific questions about potential impacts, known or unknown.
Yeah, that was, oh, go ahead, Diane, jump in.
Sure. I think just big picture around like, what do we know? I think we know that there's not currently a federal law that is designed to specifically regulate ocean-based carbon dioxide removal. But I think a big picture point to make would be that there's a lot of reason to believe that in the short term, appropriate, field research will be able to proceed under a variety of various laws and authorities. It's notable that the goal of this work, right, is carbon removal, a positive impact for the climate. And a lot of these laws were designed to prevent negative environmental impacts, and they largely didn't conceive of this more positive climate benefit. But it's also true that we don't want these projects to have a negative impact on the environment. So engaging with regulators through the permitting process can really be a positive way to really make sure that you're mitigating, avoiding risk of any projects and improving them through the process. And I think the other big picture worth noting is that on Friday, the White House announced the Fast Track Action Committee on Marine Carbon Dioxide Removal. This also known as the FTAC. And so that announcement on Friday will kick off a 60-day public comment period. And they're specifically asking for input around some of these open questions. And I'm happy to drop a link into the chat for folks. So, but this committee has been tasked with evaluating ocean-based carbon dioxide removal and helping to shape what does effective and safe research look like. And I think one of the questions was where, what federal agencies are involved. There are 12, there are more than I think a dozen federal agencies involved on carbon dioxide removal. And I think the charter of this body has, 3 goals. One is to establish a federal marine carbon dioxide removal research program. Number 2, very relevant to this conversation, is clarifying permitting regulatory standards and other policies for CDR, for marine CDR. And then there's a third mandate around public-private partnerships. But I just think it's notable that while, one law may not exist, that's never the case, number one. And number 2, I think there's a lot of reason to believe that responsible and safe research in the short term will be able to proceed under a variety of existing laws. And that there are efforts underway to drive even additional clarity, I think, around when and where which laws would apply.
If I could just jump in there, I just echo that very clearly. It's stepping way back. Our goal here is to figure out a way to permit research, pilot scale projects to answer key questions to the role that these approaches can play in addressing the climate crisis. And there are certainly many ways we can do that. I also think about the permitting as sort of what we're trying to get done right now, what the fast track action committee might be able to recommend in terms of changes and sort of medium term policy changes, and then long term, a potential legislative solution to regulating MCDR permitting.
Yeah, Jessica, if I can chime in one more subject there. I see a lot of comparisons to my experience in the marine energy sector, tidal and wave in the lakes, a very new industry to the regulatory world. It started with working within the regulatory boxes that currently exist, but over the last 15 years now, policy and legislation is coming in to support this specific technology. And I think that's where you're looking at evolving. You're working within the existing regulatory framework to a commercialized scale where legislation can support this specific effort.
Yeah, thank you all for that. And just a theme that I want to highlight, especially based off of your example, Zach, and what Vesta is doing, and Diane, what you said as well, is that research is happening, and there are avenues where research is happening, because there are ways to get those permits for those pilot studies to occur. And it's awesome to see the progress being made at the federal level, which is we typically think of as pretty slow moving, for creating medium and longer term guidance and clarification on MCDR permitting. One last question on the section of what we know now related to thinking medium and longer term is I'd love for us to riff a little bit about how we could imagine permitting being different for a pilot study or research study versus something that's a larger deployment or more commercial scale. Like what, and this is going to bridge the gap or bridge to the next section on what needs to be done or what are the gaps on permitting. Obviously, it's a spectrum. It's not just a pilot study and then suddenly it goes commercial. There's various sizes of scale. So I'll hand that off to anyone who wants to jump in on that first.
I think from a pilot study, if we look at what Zach and his team has done, you're looking at a small scale of effort and working within that framework. It depends on the technology that you're utilizing and the rapidness to commercialization, because you can use the same framework for a pilot or through to commercialization. When I say framework, regulatory framework, there are I don't know, a nationwide permit from the Army Corps, or there's the NPDES, or the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System, NPDES process with the EPA. That's through to a commercial or a large scale system. So I think it really depends on the technology that you're utilizing to achieve your goal. But I think, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on how you see it, the process is in place for a small scale through to a very large scale, and it takes the same amount of time and effort to get a small scale system approved versus a large scale. So while in the regulatory world, unfortunately, one shoe fits all, or one size fits all.
And so on that note, that's a great segue into the next thing I'd love to ask about. What are the current barriers? Zach, I know that you've recently experienced that. Cameron, I know you work with that all the time. So what are the current barriers to obtaining permits for activities like marine CDR or activities similar to that? And we can pull in some lessons from other industries, like from the marine energy space as well. And what work do we need to do to overcome some of those barriers to permitting?
Yeah, I'd be happy to jump in here. I mean, I think we talk about clarity or jurisdictional overlap, and it's not a theoretical case for us. Our application took our permitting process from application to finish, and both basically the state and federal were very similar timelines, took about 18 months. And that a big part of the delay was this jurisdictional question from EPA and the application of marine dumping laws, and conversations between the EPA and the state about whether or not to apply those actually caused the state permit to go into abeyance for a certain period of time. So it's not a, oh, how do we navigate this? In our case, it actually led to pretty significant delay in our permitting timelines. And so, we have to, getting that sort of clarity moving forward on what applies to which approach is going to be tremendously helpful. And I think on the question of research versus commercialization, this is sort of the $1 million question that's out there. I think a lot of people are looking for a clear definition of that divide, because I think a lot of stakeholders, understandably, are saying, look, we're okay with small scale pilot projects moving right now, but we don't want to give a blessing to somebody moving too big too quickly. From the industry perspective, we don't want to see that either, because if somebody goes out there, a rogue actor, or what I started calling a carbon removal pirate that is out there without the sound science, deploying a large scale in the open ocean without appropriate oversight, that's really harmful to those of us that are trying to do it right. And so striking that balance is really, really difficult. On the other side of that, sort of from a de facto perspective, US policy seems to be oriented that the private sector and startups like Vesta are leading a lot of the R&D. And it doesn't mean we need a blessing to scale tomorrow. It's that in order to attract capital to support research and development along the way, we need to have a pathway that shows that we can scale if and when our approach is shown to be safe and effective.
Yeah, I would just like to add to Zach's point there. You're in because of the early stages of this to the regulatory world, you're in an education process. You need to educate those that are regulating, because they have no idea. And so you're educating on the processes that you're utilizing, as well as the whole concept. This is one of many projects that is coming across their desk. So patience is a virtue there as well. Currently, and this is an industry-wide, not just specific here for this audience, with the huge amounts of monies flowing from the Biden administration, there are a huge number of projects being constructed, developed, implemented. That is a lot of work from a regulatory perspective. You're one of many projects somebody at an office is reviewing, and that could be at the state or the federal level. So to Zach's example there, 18 months, that doesn't surprise me. If you get federal funds associated with your project as well, you're going to have to complete the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA review associated with that, as well as all the permitting. So there are a number of layers there that paint the picture of patience. It's going to take time to get through, especially as a new industry, as a new technologies.
Yeah, and that's, that is very true. Just quickly on that point, we saw that very much at the state level, where state regulators are trying to evaluate the public good of allowing this activity. And in order to do that, they had to assess some of the carbon removal science, and they simply did not have a capacity to do that. And it would not be realistic of us to expect them to have that expertise. And so that was another hurdle, is just the lack of technical expertise at the state level in particular.
I think well said. And I think one thing I would just add is that I think thinking about gaps, it's a lot of this field research and folks who are moving into field research, it's just beginning. And so I think that it's an open question around where these gaps exist, and to to Cameron's point, you know, there's a steep learning curve for regulators as they you know, figure out how to regulate this work. And so I would just echo the patient's point. I mean, I think it's important to recognize that seeking a permit in the marine environment it's public space. It's not private land, and so it's a much higher bar in order to both seek and then secure permission. Obviously, the ocean covers 70% of the planet. So that's why I think it's worth taking this complexity head on and you know, being willing to grapple with some of this if we're able to, you know, make, I think, the impact on the climate crisis that we hope. I think the ocean is going to have to continue to play a critical role. And I think also I would just note, you know, a good permitting process will not always lead to a yes or a green light. Part of the value of a functioning permitting process is that good projects that are safe and effective and have this public benefit aspect will advance. And then those maybe that are not good ideas, bad ideas even, with too much risk or too much downside, you know, don't get approved. And so I think there's also, I think it's worth noting that when you think about gaps, I think we also want to think about the purpose of the process as being to ensure that safe, responsible projects are able to move forward, and those that don't meet that bar don't.
That's another good point, Diane. And in our case, working with the state of North Carolina, we did make changes from our sort of pre-permitting consultation and throughout the permitting process. We originally were proposing 20,000 cubic yard placement. We scaled down to about 6,000. They said, what's the smallest amount you could deploy in order to get the changes in ocean chemistry that you're looking for? And that's the number we settled on. We also, our original, our first pilot project in Long Island was done on the dry beach. We actually moved this deployment off the beach in part because we wanted to avoid conflicts with recreation and avoid conflicts with sea turtles. And that was based on some conversations with the state. So I think it also just speaks to, you know, the value of having that dialogue and willingness to sort of change and adapt in order to accommodate those other values and other stakeholders.
And if I can, Jessica, you know, Diane, you brought up a really good point of the commons. You are sharing the commons with other users, and stakeholder outreach. Listening to Zach talking about, you know, sea turtles, whatever it might be. You've got fishermen, you've got tribes, you've got other community members, whatever, in the commons there, and going back to the education, it's not just the regulatory community that needs to be educated about the technologies that or the processes that are being used, but it's the fisherman that has no idea that will it impact my honeypot of a fishing spot or not, you know. So you've got to keep that in mind as well with the stakeholder engagement.
Yeah, perfect segue. It's as if you knew exactly what I was going to ask next. And I would love to spend I would say the last like 10 minutes or so, 10 to 12 minutes of our panel discussion on how we can engage local stakeholders. And as a pre-call to this panel, something that Diane said that I want to reiterate here is that a government permit is not a social license to operate. And I'll bring up the example that may be on a lot of our listeners' minds was Planetary Technologies deploying in Cornwall, and they received a government permit, but there was not necessarily a social license to operate. The community did not approve of their deployment, and so there was some backlash. And so my question to the panel is, okay, Cameron mentioned some of the groups that do have a stake. So how do we go about engaging those stakeholders? When should that happen? How should it happen? So let's discuss that. And Diane, maybe I'll call on you first. Yeah, go ahead and unmute, because you have a lot of experience in this space.
Well, I was actually going to suggest maybe Zach talk a little bit about Vesta's experience in New York as an example for how it's happening. I think the point on since you raised it, is this, government approval is necessary but not sufficient. I think as folks are like wrapping their head around how to get to yes and how to get to a successful process. It's making sure that that it's not a checking the box exercise, that it's really meaningfully sitting down with communities, identifying key stakeholders. So the government side is necessary but not sufficient, and then this and how you approach it. I think your community engagement will really yield dividends, I think, for you, I think, as you move towards like actually beginning your project. And I thought, Zach, maybe you could talk about your New York experience.
Yeah, so the New York project was before I worked for Vesta, but I do know the history there, and I think a lot of similar lessons we learned from that, and a similar approach in Duck. And in both cases, I think one of the things that were really key is we used coastal engineers that had worked in those communities before and knew people there. And so for some approaches that are deploying pretty far offshore, it becomes pretty difficult to define some of the stakeholders. Certainly, if there are commercial fishing operations in the area, that's a very clear one. For us, we're deploying in a community, and so we try to find the coastal engineers that have historically worked in that community. They can help open doors. And both the case of New York and in Duck, we were able to secure support from town councils before we move forward with our project. And then, as I said, the example of scaling back the project, that actually happened after we started the permit process, but very on in the permit process. You basically can't start talking to the community soon enough, and you can't talk to enough people in the community. Of course, we don't have enough capacity to talk to everybody, but making the time to talk to people is incredibly important. And as an example, when we got our state permit, notification is provided to all the people who wrote in a comment. Pretty much all of our comments were negative, and a handful of them went into the state regulator. And we reached out to everybody who sent a comment to follow up, to have a conversation, to just say, hey, we're here to answer questions. And when we were able to get on the phone and talk to people and explain, this is such a small project that the risk of significant or long-term impacts is so minuscule. And when you actually start addressing their concerns and hearing where they're coming from, we were able to get a couple of people to not necessarily support a project, but to be less concerned. And I think that that's really incredibly important, is to sit there and listen and hear out your critics. And sometimes you got to take it on the chin and listen, and then also you have to adapt and change based on that feedback, as we did in the case of our Duck project. So there's a lot of different steps you can take, but it is such a critically important part of doing this well and doing it right.
Yeah, I would just add to Zach's point there. Get out in front of the stakeholder community before you submit any application whatsoever, because no one wants to read it in the newspaper as a public notice. And it could be meeting with, if I can pick on my local backyard, Washington State, could be meeting with the tribes of the area, meeting with their leadership, presenting what you're doing, how you're doing it, and where you're doing it. They have what they call UNA, usual and custom fishing rights. They would want to know, are you going to impact their fishing areas, their tribal rights? They also oversee, both at a federal and a state level, the regulatory. They are sovereign nations, and the federal government, the EPA, Army Corps, they will consult with these sovereign nations. And so getting out in front of these users of the commons. The tribes are not stakeholders. They are the tribes. They are a sovereign nation. But there is fishing fleets. There are local communities. to Zach's point, you're not going to get to everybody. You will get negative feedback or positive that someone wasn't informed about the project on, but do it before you submit any application whatsoever.
And I just wanted to add a couple of resources that folks might be interested in. One is the Reykjavik Protocol. Two is a paper that was published in the Best Practices Guide for Ocean Alkalinity Enhancement, a paper on social considerations and best practices for engaging the public. That's the link number 2. And number 3 is the Aspen Institute's Marine CDR Code of Conduct, as kind of 3 pieces that folks might be interested in checking out.
Great, thank you so much. And those resources, thank you, Diane, for sharing them. I know we were just talking about the best practices to OAE research guide the other day. That whole guide, it is a collection of about 13 or so research or published papers. Yep, you got a copy of it, a hard copy of. I would love to know where to get a hard copy because I have the PDF, but yeah, so that was put out as a guide, not necessarily a set of laws, but a lot of guidance in one place. The last question, it'll be a bit of a, I guess, vision painting question or dreaming question, is if we could paint an ideal space or ideal picture of what it would look like for a company or a group that's looking to do MCDR research or a pilot study, what would the ideal path or ideal picture look like, just briefly for our audience here, especially those who are in the audience who are thinking about starting MCDR companies or pilots?
I'm happy to just kick us off a little bit. My first thought is that in terms of permitting, I think about approaching regulators not as against you, but potentially as a partner. I think that is I think when folks are thinking about this as a pain, as a problem to overcome or avoid, I think that's where you can find yourself getting into trouble. You thinking about this as an opportunity to improve your project, to get it right. And, the field is nascent. Some of our goals are including, unlocking public funding, conducting this, early foundational research, determining the feasibility of scaling and commercialization. I think the best way we're going to be able to achieve those goals is through a really thoughtful regulatory engagement process. And so approaching it from that frame, I think will do yourself as well as the field at large a great deal of be very good.
I have a question. Can I ask?
Sure, please, Rocio, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, are there any projects in, say, international waters? And what would be the permitting process for international waters? Do you guys know? Are these all coastal?
Our approach is coastal. And I don't know, Cameron, you came off mute. Maybe you can speak to international waters.
I was just going to say, my understanding on the international waters is it is somewhat of the high seas, and outside of I don't know, UN pirate and laws and the likes, it's the high seas. So there's no country overseeing that.
Okay, so when you talk about jurisdictions, is within the country, not in countries, different countries.
Correct. Yeah. So if you look at the US, your jurisdiction it extends to either 200 miles nautical miles offshore or to the outer continental shelf, depending on which side of the country you're on.
Got it.
Okay.
There are conversations at the international level around London Protocol and London Convention, which regulate marine dumping, that are looking at some of these approaches. It's very complicated. The amendments under this international treaty are not fully in force, and under that case, it's basically if a ship is leaving from a country, they would be the regulator. There's a lot of provisions like that. Like I said, it's complicated, but one of the challenges there is, if you're a country that is not party to that, there's not little stopping, the aforementioned carbon pirates from going to a non-party country and executing their projects with little oversight. And it's certainly the challenge, like I said, would be really set back the industry as a whole.
Yeah, I would say like that's an example of a scenario that keeps me up at night. And so, that's an example of where in the near term, that would not be an advisable location for marine CDR research. I think in fact, just to put a finer point, like would set the field back, and it would not be an advisable place to do first research. And so focusing on specific countries where you can engage with a regulator and get that permission.
Got it.
Great, thanks. One question, Jonathan Kirk, if you're able to unmute, wanted to get your question in about that you had for Cameron.
Yes, sure. Thank you. So I'm just curious, Cameron, whether you've got any perspective on whether there might be parallels from the marine energy sector as to how the community engagement process and need and so on evolves over time.
Yeah, really good question. I think it's really applicable to this conversation in the sense that if we look at wave energy conversion, in the early stages, there was a lot of I'll use the pirates that Zach's working on there, but a lot of companies were proposing 200 units off of Oregon coast or New Jersey or something like that, an astronomical number, and the technology wasn't there, but it scared everybody from the regulatory to the stakeholders to the local community. Once we got past that scare tactic, the marine energy community then started evolving and to kind of what Zach is doing, small scale, introducing it to the communities and to the regulatory agencies. So it was a one-off deployment of a wave energy converter or a tidal energy device, and it would educate that community in that region. So if it's in the northeast or southeast, northwest, wherever it was, that regulatory and the users of the commons were starting to become more familiar with what was happening. And a second tier of effort was there were test facilities being operated, and that's been funded by Department of Energy or the Navy, where you can take out your system and test it and educate. If it's white papers coming out in the published forum or just meeting with regulatory folks, and also the community, the fishermen would see it, and see, okay, it's not detrimental to my fishing areas and the likes. So it's been a very slow evolution over probably 15 to 20 years. Sorry to give you a geological timeline, but it has been a very much a slow introduction and evolution there. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Chris Vivian, you had a comment about the international waters and law of the sea. Feel free to unmute and offer to the group.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Jason. Yeah, it's certainly not true that there are any regulations in international waters. As I understand it, if you are on a US registered vessel and you're in international waters, then you will still fall under the NPRSA carrying out any of these experiments. There was a presentation by Betsy Valenti from the EPA at the New Orleans Ocean Sciences meeting just last week. And she gave a detailed presentation about regulation. I don't think it's available online yet, but I think it will be in the not too distant future. So people should take a look at that to get a clearer picture of what the regulation is from a US perspective anyway. And just another point about what's in force and whether or not you have to comply with it. Even though I think there's about 6 or 7 parties that have ratified the London Protocol Amendments, and it's not in force, it's perfectly true. But under the Vienna Law of Treaties, if you've ratified something or even signed the basic convention, you're obliged not to contravene that provision, those provisions that may be in an amendment. So there's a lot more to the legal side than's been suggested earlier.
Thank you, Chris. Appreciate the further background.
Thanks, Chris. And just to clarify, I was envisioning when I say I was envisioning a non-party vessel flagged operating in the high seas outside of the London Convention and London Protocol. But you're absolutely right that a US flagged vessel operating anywhere in the world will be subject to the US laws under PRSA. And the same is true for other nations that are party to the London Convention and London Protocol.
Yeah.
Where there's a gap, where there's the pirate gap is where it's a vessel that's flagged from a country that is not party to the London Convention or London Protocol.
There's about, I think about
Thank you so much, Chris, for clarifying.
Yeah.
Thank you.
There's about 101 parties to the convention and the protocol currently, but there are quite a number of marine nations that are not party at the moment. It's perfectly true.
Shivered me timbers. That's what I have to say. Sorry.
I was just going to say too, Jessica Cross linked to EPA's guidance website, and I'll just resend this. And this does have some description of the applicability of MPRSA to vessels operating in international waters that are US flagged or emanating from US shores.
Got it. Cool. Liliana Bastian had a very good question that got upvoted about different jurisdictions. Liliana, please.
Hi, yeah, I'm with Ocean Visions. I was wondering, are there any efforts to sort of convene the permitters across coastal states so they can learn from each other, successes and challenges as they're all confronting this new issue, and talk about how they might want to establish their permitting structures?
It's a great question. I've actually been talking to some folks at the Coastal States Organization to see if we could get an effort like that underway to try to leverage some of the experiences that states are having. It's a very early conversation, but I think it's a really great venue for starting to do that cross-pollination and learn from each other. I also think one of the things I would love to see from the Fast Track Action Committee recommendations is a creation of a sort of formal technical advisory body that could help states evaluate some of this stuff where they lack the capacity to do some of the evaluation around carbon removal science.
All right. Alexi.
I have a little bit to add to that.
Oh, please, Chris, go ahead.
If you're doing it around island states, for example, in the Caribbean, one of the first places I'd start is with a coastal zone management unit. Not every island has it. Some of them have some really excellent ones. Barbados is a good example, but they can put you on the path as to what you can do within the 3-mile limit and even further offshore. So it's not necessarily an approval from the CZMU, but it's a great place to start.
Got it. Thank you. All right.
Actually, I'll just add one thing, and
please.
Liliana, you might already know about this, but I know there's an effort underway to do an marine CDR legal symposium next year that would bring together I think these folks, and Zach, it would be great to connect with you on the coastal states work and the and connect that with the Marine CDR legal symposium as well.
Great, cool.
And
Just
a comment,
please,
I'm also,
Ben.
this is Ben Slotnick with Liliana Technologies. We operate in waterways and nearshore marine environments. That comment just triggered a thought here. I'm actually been invited to give a presentation at an ABA convention here in Houston later this week. And so additional engagement with the ABA in general may actually be quite helpful, given that they appeal to a wide range of attorneys, one of which that I'm talking to is a judge from a province of the United States in the middle of the Pacific. And so there could be more there.
Okay. By the way, ABA is, just for those who are not familiar with the
American
acronym.
Bar Association.
American
Sorry
Bar
for the
Association.
acronym.
All good.
I'm not a
all
fan
good.
of acronyms.
Yep. No. We just want to make sure people are framing right. So awesome. Alexi, you've been very patient with your hand up. So go ahead and ask. Alexi, are you there? Oh, okay. All good. All good. Alexi, if you have a question, feel free to ask it in the chat, and we'll see if we can get to it. One question I have, thinking about it from a entrepreneur standpoint, curious to get the panel's recommendations on if one is running a carbon removal startup, they've applied for permitting, any ways of that the panel suggests messaging that to interested stakeholders for the startup. In other words, I'm thinking about investors, carbon credit buyers. What's been your what might be your recommendations for how to engage with people who are interested in the success of the business itself, and this could be in CDR projects or with other marine activities, just to open it up to anybody on the in our speaker list today.
Well, it's certainly challenging, right? Because you need to, like I said earlier, we need to demonstrate that path to scale, even if we're by no means ready to scale tomorrow, in order to attract capital. And you need the right kind of capital. You need patient capital that understands that it's going to take time to do that, and also need to make it clear that this is really, it's a risk of being a first actor, right? And I am convinced that within a couple of years, we're going to have we're going to continue to be able to get pilot scale projects permitted for now. And I think within the next couple of years, there's going to be a lot more clarity. And I think there's a lot of actors in the federal government in particular that are aligned around the need to make some sense and provide some guidance to everybody, whether it's an academic researcher or early stage startup, about how to get their projects done and permitted responsibly and effectively.
And I just see two kind of related questions in the chat on, and I thought I would just add, so there's a question around removal of dissolved gases or pipeline. So I just wanted to note that anything that requires attaching something to the seabed, that would fall under BOEM's jurisdiction, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. So if they, and then in terms of offshore geological storage of carbon, they are, I think BOEM is anticipating finalizing guidance regulations for offshore geological storage, I think in this year. So that will be, that guidance will come out this year.
Okay.
I was going to say, that's a really good point, Diane. We haven't talked about BOEM, and they are a significant federal lead out to 200 miles or out of continental shelf, as well as the Army Corps of Engineers. So I saw in the chat somebody asking about some test rig out to 12 nautical miles. You're looking at 200 miles, give or take. But to Diane's point, BOEM was also very large gorilla in the room with that.
Okay. And the website for them is boem.gov for those who are interested. All right. With that, we're pretty much at the end of our discussion today. So I just want to say thank you to our speakers. Thank you to Jessica for moderating. Thank you to our audience. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get to all the questions, but I've added the panelist emails for you to get in touch with them after we conclude today. Also, a couple of other notes. We have our post-event survey. How do we do today? Any feedback you can provide? Good, bad, indifferent. Were the jokes interesting? Please say, any and all comments are welcome. So that we'd love to hear how we can make our events better for you, our audience, so that we provide content that is going to advance the field of carbon removal worldwide. So thank you for thank you for any kind of commentary you can provide. Also, our next event is going to be on enhanced rock weathering, measurement, reporting, and verification. There's been a lot of really exciting advances in the field. That's going to happen on March 12th. And we're going to be announcing the panelists for that shortly. With that, just want to once again say thank you to everybody who's attended today. Thank you to, once again, to all of the people who've made today's event a success. And we look forward to seeing you at our next Air Miners event.